welcome to Holston Church this morning. I hope that you'll be encouraged by our fellowship and our lesson today. Please drop us a line, let us know that we're helping you or in what ways that we can minister. We ask you that you would tune in each week and pray for our ministry as we try to move forward and offer grace and mercy in the world today. As we do each week, we just want to remind everyone of our four foundational principles. First being the sovereignty of God. Second, a non-literal interpretation of scriptures. Thirdly, a preterist or optimistic outlook. And fourthly, a thinking, critical faith. We'd also ask you to remember those in our fellowship who are sick, and we've had some pass away the last couple of weeks, and we're very concerned about the families of those who are having to go through this terrible time, and we pray that you would remember them during your prayer time. Our other church fellowships too, we'd love for you to keep those in your mind and hearts. Ones that we have in Kentucky, Virginia, and other areas here in East Tennessee. We'd also like for you to please remember our upcoming spring 2022 conference entitled Rethinking the Resurrection. Our spring conference this year, which we're very excited about, Rethinking the Resurrection, will be March 26th and March 27th. There'll be a morning session on Saturday, March the 26th, which will include Brother Daniel Rogers from Alabama, Elder Scott Laughlin from here at Holston. The evening session at 6 p.m. that Saturday will include Brother Michael Miano from the Blue Point Bible Church in Long Island, New York, along with Elder Reese Maggard, who is one of our local elders. March 27th, that morning session will include Elder Alvin Dixon from the Mount Carmel Union Baptist Church in Sparta, North Carolina, with myself included in that session, talking about the historic debates that have surrounded the subject of the resurrection. We'll be concluding our study this week through the Feasts of the Lord. Elder Mike Cornett will conclude by looking at the Feasts of Booze. We'll record this and make this available this coming week on the Facebook page. Our lesson today will be a continuation, will be a part 2 of the study that we started last week called From a Death Cult to a Living Faith. As we introduced this subject last week, I hope that you remember some of the key terms that we looked at and some of the key ideas that are so valuable for this study. From a death cult to a living faith, or how do we move forward from fear and embrace life? So last week we looked at some key ideas. We looked at why do people believe we're living in the last days. We had delved into the fact that there is a bias called the negativity bias, which keeps us looking for the most fearful aspects of life. We also looked at historical ignorance, just the fact that there's been so many predictions made and prophecies made throughout the entire history of the Christian church, and each of them have not come to fruition. So, in doing this, we want to look today at our second part, and what did the early church actually believe? So what did the early church believe? We want to look at this from 3 different approaches. First, we want to see what was St. Paul's view. Secondly, as modern scholars have looked back, what about failed prophecy? And thirdly, what's the point? Why look at any of this, and what's in it for you? Okay, in order for us to understand Paul's views, we have to approach the scripture by putting it in chronological order for it to make sense. If we know when these letters were written, it's easier to understand what's going on at the time and why Paul addresses certain issues. Now, looking at Paul's timeline here, we can see that Paul's conversion was around 35 AD. This is a few years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Paul's first missionary journey, which is in 46 to 48 AD. And of course, we find in the book of Acts where Paul attends the council at Jerusalem where he meets with the apostles. Now we begin to see Paul's writing. And we often think that the Gospels are the earliest written words because they're placed that way in the New Testament. But we have to remember, just because a book in Scripture is placed in a certain order does not mean it's the earliest in chronology. So most scholars will date the letter of the Galatians or letter to the Galatians around 50 AD. So we understand that the Roman Jewish wars are going on at this time, and Jerusalem doesn't fall till 70 AD. So we've got all this time that's built into this era leading up to the Roman and Jewish wars. So it hasn't reached its point yet of where there is this upheaval. So you have Paul writing Galatians in 50 AD. So this is the earliest writing of Paul that we understand. And then secondly, we have in the years 51 and 52, Paul's first and second letter to the Thessalonians. Now, since this is the earliest representation of Paul's understanding, this is where we want to focus. Now, we can come back later at some other studies and look through the Corinthians, the Romans, and of course the other letters that are attributed to Paul that lead up to these years before Paul's death, because we know Paul is executed in 67 AD, a few years before the destruction of Jerusalem. Laying the groundwork, let's look at the letter to the Galatians, just a short summary. So we understand Galatians was written around 49 to 50 AD. Scholars will debate that back and forth, but that's generally where they land. And the Galatians was written, of course, against the Judaizers. It's those who are telling the newly converted Christians that they have to still take on the circumcision and the food laws, and they have to remain kosher and be Jewish in their identity while still remaining Christian. So the main theme we find here that Paul is writing is about justification by divine grace through faith in Jesus, against the Judaizing doctrine of meritorious works of the law. In other words, Galatians insists on Christian liberty from any doctrine of salvation that requires human effort in addition to divine grace. So we don't find much about the end times or what we're to get from Paul's view about the end of the world or the end of the age. So now the next oldest or the earliest documentation we have for Paul we find in the year 50 to 51. So 1 Thessalonians is summed up, of course, as a congratulatory letter with the theme of comfort. Paul's letters to the church in Thessalonica are best known for their teaching about the second coming of Jesus and associated events. 1 Thessalonians includes congratulations upon conversion and Christian growth and exhortations to further progress, with emphasis on comfort from and expectancy toward the second coming. So there's a lot of focus in 1 Thessalonians about the imminent second second coming and the return of Jesus, which when you look in the Gospels, you find that the Gospel writers include the fact that Jesus is saying, there are those among you here that shall not taste death until you see the Son of Man coming. So it's important to understand that, and we'll see that Paul shares that same sense of urgency and imminency. Now, some will argue, because we find in the Second Thessalonian letter that Paul is giving some correction about the second coming. There are those, because he says, of course, again, this is the year 50 and 51 along the same line. So Paul writes the first letter, and apparently there's some confusion that takes place in the church at Thessalonica. So between the two letters in the Thessalonians, there's risen among these believers a belief in the immediacy of Jesus' return to destroy their persecutors. And by immediate, Paul and others are thinking, well, it's going to happen at this time. It's going to happen within, maybe the year 52 or 53, because there's some that are actually selling all they have and getting ready, or they're just not working. They've just stopped working because they're saying Jesus is going to come anytime in that immediate state of, maybe 52, 53 AD. They just weren't sure. So Paul's saying, not so fast. The end of the age rebellion against God must take place first. So go back to just living a normal lifestyle. Go back to work. Don't just give up. It's not time yet. But he's not saying it's going to be 2,000 years down the road. He's just saying it's going to be here on us, but it's just not within the year or two here where people are just stopping work and selling everything they have. Specifically, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5, 1 through 11, now, brothers, about times and dates we do not need to write to you, for you know very well that the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night. While people are saying peace and safety, destruction will come on them suddenly as labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. But you, brothers, are not in darkness, so that this day should surprise you like a thief. You are sons of light and sons of the day. We do not belong to the night, nor to the darkness. So then let us not be like others who are asleep, but let us be alert and self-controlled. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk at night. But since we belong to the day, let us be self-controlled, putting on faith and love as a breastplate, and the hope of salvation as a helmet. For God did not appoint us to suffer wrath, but to receive salvation through the Lord Jesus Christ. He died for us so that, whether we are awake or asleep, we may live together with him. Therefore, encourage one another, build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. So Paul is making it very clear here that for some, they are not looking for this, and they'll be taken surprised by it. So we believe, of course, that takes place a few years after this, during the Roman-Jewish wars and the occupation ultimately of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. So here we find a summary of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Basically, Paul is saying those who die before the second advent of Christ are at no disadvantage. So there are some people, because of the statements about that there are some among you that will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming, they're thinking, well, what's going to happen to them? Well, Paul is saying, don't worry, that they're at no disadvantage, and that when Christ returns, we'll all be gathered to him and live with him forever. That's the message of 1 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians, Paul is saying the day of the Lord has not come. It has not come during the writing of this, which was, again, 50 to 51 AD. It doesn't say, Paul's not saying you need to wait till the year 2000 or beyond. That's just not what Paul is saying. Those who persecute you will not ultimately get those who persecute you now will ultimately get what's coming to them. So he's saying endure persecutions for the moment, that these people will be dealt with. And please stand firm in the faith. This sums up Paul's understanding of what is going on in his day, again, around this era in the 1st century, prior to what is to come with the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, the reason why I'm going into a lot of this detail is to illustrate the fact that we have to think about these questions. Did the end of the age happen? Now, some will point to these scriptures of Paul and say, see, Paul is saying that the end hasn't come. It's going to come sometime way out into the future. We don't know when, but some purport, of course, that they know when, because we looked last week at lots of eras in history, lots of people in history, lots of even good people and godly people and very intelligent people who made predictions and was insistent that the Lord is coming soon. And it just kept proceeding over and over again with no literal or physical coming of Jesus. So we need to look at this. Is this a failed prophecy? Jesus said he was coming in the lifetime of those that were in front of him. Now, unless we say that these people were going to live for thousands of years and that they're around today, we have to reevaluate the way we approach those scriptures. So we want to say, did the end happen? Did the end of the age happen? Well, if the end of the age didn't happen, then it's a failed prophecy. So we have to look and say, well, was this a literal physical coming of a physical kingdom out of the sky? Was a 5'8" bearded Jesus going to walk on physical clouds and come back down to the earth? If it didn't happen in that day, it's a failed prophecy. Next, we have to think, well, was this an allegorical or spiritual fulfillment that did take place? Well, let's look at that. I don't want to make conclusions for you, but I want to help us think through this and guide us through a thorough thinking of this very subject. One of the main reasons this is so important is because in the last few hundred years, there's been a tremendous amount of critical work done to understand something about the historical Jesus. Now, Albert Schweitzer was an early 20th century scholar. He not only was a theologian, but Albert Schweitzer was very famous for being a humanitarian, a genius doctor, not just of theology either. Albert Schweitzer was a celebrated musician. He's one of these types that had about 7 different PhDs, who was very intelligent, but also a very godly man on top of that. So Albert Schweitzer wrote a book called The Quest for the Historical Jesus. He did this because about 300 years earlier, there was a French scholar who began to look at the question of how can we know something about the historical Jesus outside of what we find in the Gospels? Because normally with historical studies, you want to look at primary source documents, say whether it be for George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, whether it be for Napoleon Bonaparte. You don't want to just take secondhand accounts or what people that admired that person said about them. You want to look at just documents that seem innocuous, but that have something objective that they say about them. Now, there are some historical aspects to what we can find about the historical Jesus, but what Reimarus was saying in the 1700s, this French thinker, was saying that so much of what we understand is about the divinity of Jesus, which is called the Christ. So this became, among scholars, Biblical scholars now, these weren't atheists, these were biblical scholars wanting to understand what can we know about the historical Jesus instead of the Christ of faith that has developed out of the Roman Catholic tradition, the Protestant tradition, and the Orthodox traditions. So this led up to lots of criticisms and studies which were called the quest for the historical Jesus. Albert Schweitzer began this conversation again in the early 20th century, and it's very important to our understanding of the first century and has been extremely helpful in helping us understand more about that time period so we can interpret the New Testament in a more accurate fashion. So as we look at what scholars have tried to understand about the life of Jesus, we see that the quest for the historical Jesus was written in 1906 by Albert Schweitzer. We understand, of course, that we have the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Since this time, we've also found Gnostic Gospels or later stories that were rejected, not put in the canon of Scripture, because although these are very interesting, and I do recommend people read the Gnostic Gospels. They're extremely interesting, helpful, and give you a clear picture of what the early church was wrestling with and the different traditions that grew. So this is what scholars look at. They look at every source. They don't just take one or two books out of the Bible and say this is all we're going to study. They want to study everything that you can find that grew out of the Christian tradition. So lots of these studies have been very helpful and have led, again, to very accurate understandings about the early church. Now, the earliest references we find about the historical Jesus, we find in, of course, Josephus and his Jewish Antiquities. Josephus was a Jew, but he was one that converted to a Roman during those Jewish-Roman wars in the first century. And he was, of course, a historian that was employed by the Roman elites. And he wrote a history of the first century in 93 AD. And then, of course, we find the Roman historian Tacitus mentions Jesus in the Annals of Rome around 116 AD. So there's a historical summary we also find outside of the Bible, where Jesus was a Jewish rabbi who was executed by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate for stirring up religious unrest in Jerusalem. So these are some of the minimal facts that we know about the historical person Jesus. And it's not just about the Christ of theology that grew out of this later. Of course, there's also other interesting books of the Apocrypha that we find that's part of Jewish historical literature and Jewish theological apocalyptic traditions, and they also weren't considered canonical. But some traditions have included the Apocrypha into their translations or into their Bibles. There's even some that we find of the King James Version of the Bible that include the Apocrypha. So these are very interesting developments that have taken place. And a lot of it has come through these scholars. So we don't want to discount them and say that they're not worth our study and our time. So the reason why we mention this is to say that Albert Schweitzer came to the conclusion out of all of his study, as have a lot of modern theological scholars and biblical scholars, that Jesus said he was coming back in the lifetime of the apostles and those that came after him. And so that didn't happen, so you have a failed prophecy. That if we are to interpret the Gospels, and especially Paul's writing, as meaning that Jesus is going to come back in a physical form, like we said, he's going to be about 5'8", and he's ripping apart the sky and coming down in a physical way and bringing the kingdom to earth with him. If we interpret it that way, then we have to say that Jesus was wrong. and that the apostles were wrong, and that we have a failed prophecy. If this is so, then our faith, of course, would be in vain. So we're left with a huge problem that you can ignore. Lots of people do that. Lots of Christians ignore the problem altogether and say, well, I don't care what scholars say. I don't care what anyone else says. I want to believe what I want to believe. Well, that's your right. You can go on believing whatever you want, and it may not affect you in any negative way. But I will say that if you want to take the Bible serious, and if you want to take these conversations in a serious way, we have to deal with these issues. And if the issue is you believe there's going to be a physical Jesus coming down out of the sky that's going to kick butt and, take apart the world and reframe it, then we've got a problem, because what has been stated about that didn't come true, and therefore it's failed. As I was explaining earlier, those who participated in this first quest to find what they could about the historical Jesus, or what could they determine to be actual historical fact outside of just some of the stories that had grown out of the life of Jesus, where of course Reimarus, that we had mentioned, was the first serious scholar to do studies into that, and we see others along the way that led up to the time of Albert Schweitzer, David Strauss being one in particular. But Schweitzer had the most influence. So if you want to research any of this, we welcome you to do so. So here we go. We must deal with this question. If it's failed prophecy, then we have to see either the prophecies of the end of the age came true or they failed. We have to meet that challenge and figure out what we want to do with it. So if they failed, then modern critics have reason to disregard Christianity's truth claims, which means we don't have a leg to stand on. Failed prophecy is really pretty much the end of faith. It's the end of the Christian faith in that sense. But we can either have failed prophecy, or we could consider the preterist interpretation, which again, the preterist interpretation is that the end of the age did happen. It happened in the sense that the old covenant age ended when God used the armies of Rome, according to how this is interpreted in this tradition, is that the armies of Rome came in, ransacked the capital city, Jerusalem, and destroyed the temple, and therefore destroyed that religion altogether, because we don't have a physical temple-based religion after that. Even Judaism changed into rabbinic Judaism, which hasn't practiced temple worship since that time. That's why there's so much fervor now when they reestablish the state of Israel, and why there's talk of wanting to reestablish those type of temple services. They've not done that yet, but of course these are discussions, and even among Christians who are along those lines that believe that sort of thing will say, that they're very excited that there's a red heifer, and that there's all these, rabbis that are coming together wanting to reinstitute the temple service. Now, we don't really think from our position that would be very beneficial, since this matter has been put to rest, because we understand that the end of the old covenant meant the end of temple worship, that God is no longer worshipped in temples of men and physical temples built by the hands of man. But Paul even tells us, and Jesus alludes to this, that there's coming a time when you won't worship in Jerusalem, and you won't be worshiping in the mountain, but you'll worship God in spirit and truth. And Paul says this. Paul talks about a house not made with hands. This is what Abraham was looking for, a house not made with hands that cannot be corrupted. So this is why that we believe that corruption has already taken on incorruptibility, because you cannot corrupt this house that God has built, because it's not made with human hands. Now, this is what's wrapped up into the preterist interpretation. So what's the point we're trying to make here? Either we're waiting for an end that has already occurred, or we move forward with all confidence that this is God's world. This is our place that we can stop and take our breath for a minute and ponder this. Now, we can still wait for an end. We can sit here and wait. This is why I call this a death cult, because lots of people are waiting for something to happen in the future, and they're not taking responsibility for the here and now. They're simply stating that we're waiting, because they'll say again and again, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. And we sing these songs. We sing songs that we don't belong to this world, that we need to get out of it, and that we welcome death. This is why I refer to this as a death cult, because so many seem to be trapped in this notion that they'll never be happy until they get to heaven. And in doing so, they don't consciously, I don't believe, do this in some way to be negative, but it has negative consequences nonetheless. So again, we're either waiting for an end that, from our perspective, has already occurred, or we can move on. We can move forward, knowing this is God's world and God has a future. God not only has a future for him, but He's got a future for you, and He's got something for you to do. Many believe that if everyone would just think like they do, the world would finally be made right. If we could just convert everybody, if all the Christians could just convert Muslims, if everyone would just be Christian, or Muslims think if everybody would be a Muslim. Buddhists think if they could, convince the world to be Buddhist, that the world would be better. Hindus in the same way. Some, of course, would say if we could just get back to that golden age of yesterday, yesteryear, that if we just get back to that, that would really solve all of our problems. Atheists will insist that everything will be made right once we finally get rid of religion. Atheists, they think that's the biggest problem. Biggest problem in the world right now is religion. If we could just ever get rid of it, the world would finally be made right. Politicians promise that voting for the right party, that'll make the world right. Yeah, that'll get it. If you'll just vote us in, we're going to get it right. And how many times have we been disappointed over and over, thinking that that's the solution? I'll even throw in anarchists. Anarchists insist that abolishing the state will finally make it all right. What I want to get at is, there's a pattern. You see a pattern here. People think if everyone would just think like they do, like their group, whether it's Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, atheist, political parties, anarchists, it's all the same. They're all saying, if you could just get everybody like me, if we get, if people just listen to me, I'd solve their problem. That's basically what they're saying. That's not really what's going to help. So we want to take a look at the fact that it's not conformity or orthodoxy that brings justice and peace. That's not what we teach. Alternatively, one can strive to increase grace, increase our grace, give it away, our mercy and understanding of others not like us. These are the things we want to focus on. It's not about you have to conform to our principles. That's why I say over and over, you don't have to be a preterist. You don't have to be universalist. You don't have to be a primitive Baptist. I tell people lots of times, if you don't like our tradition, you don't need to be here. There's lots of other traditions in the Christian faith. Or if you find help in other religions, go at it. If If your worldview is atheist and you can't see anything have to do with religion, I wouldn't hold you back. Do what makes you happy. Because it's not about conformity. It's not about orthodoxy, because the orthodox always say they're the ones that are right, that their interpretation is always right. This is why we don't entertain notions of inerrancy, because inerrant scriptures don't solve anything. Everybody argues over inerrant scriptures because what it comes down to is their inerrant interpretation of those scriptures. And that's what they say is the most important. So that's why we say, alternatively to all of this, we want to offer grace, mercy, and increase our understanding of others that are not like us. This, I believe, is where we can find justice and peace. Not perfectly, and we wouldn't advocate that doing this is going to make the world a utopian dream, or that it's going to be paradise on earth. It's definitely not what we're saying, because the only real grace, mercy, and peace that we can find is in Christ, and that Christ Spirit leads us, that we want to understand others that aren't like us. That's why Jesus went out to those that were considered sinners and outcasts of culture and society. He wanted to say, we need to understand them. If we don't understand them, how are we ever going to show mercy and grace to them? The final point I would like to make in this lesson is to just encourage you. Stop waiting. Stop waiting for the end. And let's start doing. We could wait on something that's probably already taken place, and if you still insist that you want to believe that there's going to be something in the future, like many teach, I wouldn't try to convince you otherwise. But I would say, instead of waiting, instead of saying that this world is not my home, that I'm just a passing through, how about we start offering some mercy? How about we start offering grace to each other and start treating each other with a common humanity, whether they're in your tribe or not, because we all want to go out and save the lost, man, and it's always the lost because they're not in our group. It's not we believe they're damned for hell or whatever you want to think of, but we think they're lost because they're not in our tribe, they're not in our group, they're not in our denomination or church. And I would offer too, Paul tells us in his writing to put on and put off. These are really good exercises where we can put on being honest and put off lying. Put on being honest with ourselves and honest with others. And that's the only way you can put off lying to yourself or lying to other people or wearing a mask all the time and not letting people see who you actually are because we're so embarrassed of it. Because what we should be doing is not worrying about everything in the world that's going to destroy us. We could worry about how about living. The God who is the source of all of life, really asks us to just live fully. Just live fully. And God, who is the ground of all being, is saying, just be you. How about you be the best you that you can be? Whatever that is. If you pick up garbage for a living, if you're a lawyer, if you're a truck driver, if you're retired, if you're disabled and you're not able to work, but you're able to give people encouragement or give them a listening ear, how about you just be the best you? And you live fully, and you give your love, love and mercy. And let's get away from all the negative and waiting on God to come kick ass and take names. And instead of that mentality, we could imagine, just dare to imagine that there is a world that's in front of us. Too many times we're waiting for something out in the future. something that's so much better than the present because we're afraid of what's right here in front of us. But what's right here in front of us now is what we are and who we have. Instead of waiting in the future for everything, let's start living for now. And that means love, live, and be you. And be thankful for that. And let's rejoice together in the fact that Christ has redeemed us, and He's called us, and He's reconciled us. And that's something to be happy about. Being reconciled, as Paul teaches us in 2 Corinthians, that all this is from God, who reconciled us to Himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. Let's not forget that this week. Let's remember we've been reconciled in order to reconcile. We're glad that you were here with us this week. Let us know how we can help. We're always glad to hear from you, and please stay tuned each week to our updated Facebook page.